Well, welcome everyone on a very snowy and cool Sunday afternoon to our podcast to talk about some legislative preview. I'm Nick Gevock. I'm the Conservation Director at the Montana Wildlife Federation. And today I'm up here in Kalispell on both personal and work business. And we're joined today with Frank Szollosi. And Frank is the Executive Director of the Montana Wildlife Federation, as well as Senator Jill Cohenauer. Senator Cohenauer has served on the Senate Fish and Game Committee for 2 sessions or 3?
Three.
Three. Okay.
The Senate and all of my time in the House too. So.
Right. Okay. Yes. So Senator Cohenauer will be in her 4th legislative session as a state senator. She represents a district that includes East Helena and parts of the Helena Valley. So welcome to both of you. And we're just going to have a little legislative preview here, both on the state and federal level. So we're also hopefully going to be joined by Quentin Kujala, who is now the Chief of Staff for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And I haven't heard from Quentin, but he might be jumping on just a little bit late here. And he has long been very actively involved in the agency's legislative efforts. So with that, for people who have certainly followed, we know that there are often a lot of bills affecting fish and wildlife management, public lands habitat, access opportunities. And then, of course, every legislative session, Montana FWP has to have a budget, just like every state agency. So those all really drive how the agency operates for 2 years, what its priorities are. I always like to say that FWP is an agency that operates with one small exception, entirely self-funded agency. So it has about a $98 million annual budget, more than 700 employees. And the only exception to the agency not being self-funded comes in the Aquatic Invasive Species Program, which is fairly new and has gotten really cranked up in the last 4 or 5 years. So FWP is funded, as we know, with fishing and hunting license dollars, federal matching excise tax dollars, and those, of course, would be Pittman-Robertson funds on sporting firearms and ammunition and sporting equipment, Dingell-Johnson funds for fishing tackle, and then, of course, some user fees like fees at state parks and those type things. So anyway, just a welcome again to both of you. Frank, I don't know if you wanted to start off with a couple small comments before I sort of preview the 2021 legislative session.
No, let's get right. Roll tape, Nick. Go ahead.
Okay, Senator, you want? Yeah, you're good.
I'm good.
Well, I will say that, and I, of course, when I'm traveling the state on some of my hunting and angling adventures, I try to meet with legislators, and FWP has often let's just say, drawn a lot of attention in the legislature, but I don't see as much of that this session. One of the things we're really thankful for is back in 2015, we completely rewrote the hunting and fishing license structure, and that has paid huge dividends for Montana FWP. It really slightly raised some fees, but more importantly, set a 4-year cycle to look at our hunting and fishing license fees. And it used to be a 10-year cycle, so FWP would build up these big surpluses and then on the tail end start running deficits. And 10 years, I mean, we all know inflation, and we're not paying the same for a can of beans as we did 10 years ago or anything else like that. So point being, this 4-year cycle gives a little more predictability to review what our hunting and fishing license dollars are, what the fees are, and if they're keeping up with inflation and the demands for the agency. So the first cycle where we went through and looked at those was 2019. And in fact, we did not have an increase in hunting and fishing license fees. And that's a good thing. And the agency is now fiscally sound. It has the reserves it needs to address challenges like chronic wasting disease, which we're going to talk about some. That's costing the agency a lot of money, but the money is there. Other than that, last session we had an incredibly strong budget that addressed some capital needs like new equipment, boats, ATVs,
State
trucks
park,
for the, what's that?
state parks.
Yes, yeah, we had a big victory in the, finally, after almost 20 years, a slight increase in the license fee for our state parks. And that was something, and I know, Senator, you worked on that along with Senator Gauthier he really led the effort on that. He was really proud of that.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else budget-wise? We had some issues coming out of the 2017 legislative session with how our game warden staff time was funded. We went to 30% on Pittman Robertson dollars, and anybody who knows, there's some really tight sideboards on that funding, which we think is one of the strengths of what I would argue is one of the most successful programs in our nation's history. And it was 30% of their time was for Pittman Robertson. Well, they couldn't be doing enforcement. That was a big problem. But again, through bipartisan efforts last session, we got that cleaned up.
Mhm.
We went to 15%, and it's aggregate. So if there are particular wardens who enjoy that type of work, they can do that. So that was a big win. We really are in strong shape. And, this session, we really want to focus on maintaining our really quality access programs. Of course, the flagship being Habitat Montana.
Well, it's
Maintaining.
gonna be huge, Nick, I think, to make sure that Habitat Montana is protected through the legislative session. One of the things that we're going to have to do is educate a whole new crop of legislators about the importance of that program and how necessary it is to hunting and fishing and the heritage of that in Montana, and why it's the best thing that we've got going on the ground for access and everything on behalf of folks. So that's educating those new legislators, mentoring them into the program so that they understand its importance is going to be one of my top priorities in the legislature.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that Senator Cohenauer is a member, one of the leaders of the Montana Sportsman's Caucus. Is that the proper name?
It's a co-chair.
Co-chair, yes. But we really have, I'm proud, the Montana Wildlife Federation led the way, working with the Elk Foundation, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and several other organizations in building this Montana Sporting Coalition. And the last two sessions, we've had legislative socials, we've had a luncheon, we've really worked to build knowledge and understanding of what Habitat Montana is and how it works. And I agree with you, Senator. The great thing is we have so many concrete examples of the success of Habitat Montana. Just in August, we closed out, we being Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, closed out 21,400 acres of conservation easements, all in far eastern Montana. Those are just the private acres that are under easement. That doesn't include the adjoining or inholding public lands that are opened up through that program. I mean, this is really quality stuff.
And that's really the education program that has to take place, because when we did that training during the legislature and had that luncheon and basically had everybody come and fed them lunch and showed them where Habitat Montana dollars are being spent across the state, where you can see it's in eastern Montana and western Montana, in the south and the north. I mean, there's the benefit of those dollars on the ground for access and the ability to get across private land to access those places that you wouldn't have access to if we didn't have some easements. And those folks, I think that's part of the reason this last session that Habitat Montana wasn't touched. It was supported. We didn't have the big fights over it because we had taken the time to educate people about it, what it means to them in their local areas. So important.
I agree. I just met yesterday with Senator Blaisdell, and of course he's been a strong supporter, and we, I'm really glad we're spending some of these Habitat Montana dollars in far eastern Montana, because you're going to get more bang for the buck through conservation easements out there, just because there's such a higher percentage of private land. But we can never leave out what a tremendous benefit this is for private landowners who make literally a major life decision on whether they want to put an easement on their ranch.
And a lot of times, Nick, it's the one thing that's going to keep them solvent. I mean, that's part of why a lot of them are doing it, is because they don't have the capital to put on the ground to improve their own, private holdings. And to be able to get an easement and put that easement out there is a lot of the support system that allows for them to maintain their ag history. I mean, to be able to continue to keep the land and keep it in their families. And, when you talk to the folks that have taken part in this program and used it to basically help them to maintain their own properties, they're all for it. And they understand the importance of what they're doing and what it means to the future of Montana.
I agree. It's also why the bill that, we all followed the fight over conservation easements and whether land board approval was required, that was tied to the Horse Creek complex. And, that was a big win for us because no landowner, anybody, in my previous life as a newspaper reporter, I covered some of these, and families have hard conversations around the table for literally years before they even approach a land trust. What I like to say is there's a whole menu of options out there. You can, not do anything with your property. That's your property right. You can look for easements that don't have a public access component, and you can approach some of the major land trusts like the Nature Conservancy or the Montana Land Alliance, or you can go to Habitat Montana. And certainly those easements pay more because they're giving up more of their private property rights when there's a public access component. If you looked at private property rights as a bundle of sticks, they're certainly giving up a lot more when they choose a Habitat Montana easement. But of course, a lot of these properties in far eastern Montana, they wouldn't appraise quite as high in terms of the conservation easement values without that. So we want to be vigilant on any bills like the one that came through in I don't even remember the number, but in 2019,
Fixed it.
that would affect that. And of course, that bill did pass, and the Governor Bullock vetoed that, and we were thankful for that. So those are some of the elements that we'll be looking for. FWP's budget, of course, looking for making sure it has the resources it needs to do its job. Protecting Habitat Montana. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple specific bills that will be coming up. I don't know if you'd call them cleanup bills, but let me let Senator Cohenauer talk about wildlife location data, because she got a bill passed last session, which we did support, that made it a crime to use GPS specific data to hunt, harvest, or harass animals. And now we're building on that. So Senator, and I have the bill draft in my hand, but why don't you talk about a lot of work in the interim on this one?
Well, and a lot of work in the interim and a lot of work during this session with 3 bill drafts, I think, and multiple hearings and killing the bill and coming back to life and trying to work through the issues with it. Because the first bill that I did was really to protect the data, straight up protect the data, and basically say that if it could be used for hunting, harassing, or killing the animals, that you couldn't have it. Well, the Newspaper Association and the State Library uses a lot of data information and actually provides that to people doing research. And so you had that from the State Library of they have they just have the need to be able to give that to people. And then you've got the newspaper folks on the other side who are basically saying, it's right to know. The state has that information. It is a constitutional right to know by the people of the state, so they can't keep a handle on that information. But to my thought process is there's a balance there, though, because we, have the responsibility to protect the wildlife of the state of Montana. And to me, when you start seeing these things online where people are putting up game cams and they find the biggest bull you possibly can, and then they're selling people the information about where that darn thing is, specifically, exactly where it's at. We started seeing that all over the internet over the past few years. People are selling that information. It's become monetized, and you're monetizing the wildlife of Montana. And that's not our heritage. It's not the way we do business here. So that was the impetus for the bills to attempt to do something. And essentially, we were able to get out of the last session by saying, okay, you can have the information, but if you use it in a way that harasses, harms, or kills the animals, and especially the big game ones, that you'll have criminal penalties for that. And so in order to continue that conversation, there's been a long discussion on EQC, the Environmental Quality Council, about maybe what's that next step. Are we going to be able to actually have the department protect certain aspects like sagebrush, sage grouse, lax, or, you know, some of those like grizzly bear dens and some of that information, so that we keep our hunting as a hunt and not as a, I can fly in on my helicopter and land and go kill that thing. I mean, that's just not how we do things in Montana. And why is that okay? I mean, I tried to explain this during the legislature is, if somebody can just buy that information, what does that do to Montana hunters who have their honey hole that they have worked for years? They understand where the animals go, where they are, and some out-of-state desk jockey with a lot of money can just fly in and walk in and kill the biggest thing walking around. That is just unheard of. So it was a very interesting interim to try to work through the issues with the folks that still have concerns about it, especially the media folks. And so the way that it's going to come out is, I think, a little bit helpful to the department, where you're still going to be able to access the information, but the department's going to have a responsibility to notify the people that get the information that you're not going to get it, and there's going to be a time lag to it. And you're also not going to, you're going to get your warning, and you're going to sign that you understand that if you use that information or give it to somebody else for them to use to hunt, harass, or kill a big game animal or any animal, that you will face the criminal prosecution. So I think we've gotten to a point where at least we can, work through the issues and the concerns that were had by the folks that just could not see holding that information back. But it gives the ability for the department to basically protect that information in time, give it a time lag, and then give the warning to folks that this is what you will face if you abuse this information. So I'm pretty happy about it. I haven't heard whether they allowed for me to carry it or not. Every time I got on to the EQC committee, I begged and pleaded with them to allow me to carry the bill in the next session. And I did not hear how that went in the committee on whether or not they're going to let me or not. But I sure hope so, because I think there was an awful lot of work that's been put in by the department, FWP, by the state library, by all of these groups meeting multiple times over this interim to try to find that compromise. And it was really, really, helpful to have groups like the Wildlife Federation and everybody at the table trying to help out with that, because we can't do this without everybody working together.
Well, and I brought an interesting perspective because I spent 11 years as a reporter, of course, and we were always, if it's public information, we want it. But the other element of the bill, and again, I have the draft here, is that there can be some, buffering in terms of you might get a section or a township. I mean, it's the difference. What I think anybody would agree, or most hunters would agree, falls right into the issue of fair chase and ethical hunting, is literally pinpointed GPS coordinates versus knowing that we're talking about maybe down to a section, which puts you within half a mile or a mile of an animal, or, so I think it is a decent compromise. And those were hard conversations with John McDonald and the Montana Newspaper Association. And I think we have something that'll work. Hopefully we can get that through. So, and
the fact that it's coming through the interim committee, I think is really super helpful, because that is really in the interim committee. I don't know if a lot of people know, but our interim committees are balanced, Democrats and Republicans. And so when something comes through an interim committee, it has to have bipartisan support. Otherwise, it doesn't come through as a committee bill. But that may not be the case as we move forward, because they keep talking about changing our rules. So,
right. Well, good. So that'll be one bill we'll certainly have. Another one, I'll whip through a couple of these so we can keep moving forward. We are going to have a bill finally, after many, many years, requiring mandatory trapper education. I really want to commend Montana trappers. Really on it. There will be some, just like I read some people who will be grandfathered in. A bill addressing cleaning out the ballast and on boats, and this again is about the aquatic invasive species. And then I'm holding up FWP's list, and some of these are just cleanup bills that pertain to enforcement, revise unlawful possession statute. This was addressing a loophole about unlawful possession where a hunter could have killed a game animal and simply abandoned it in the field and not be charged with possession. Often FWP staff really looks through these and they have to clean those up. A Mother's Day free fishing weekend, I think that we can all agree with that. Revise the Wildlife Habitat Improvement Act. This was the bill we got through back in 2017, the WHIP program. And again, this is just a cleanup bill, but we've had a tremendous response from landowners on that who are very excited about putting some sportsmen and sportswomen dollars toward weed treatments and habitat improvements, both on their public and private lands. That requires an access component. Addressing the home to hunt requirements, allowing family members to accompany non-residents. That's about youth when they're here from out of state. And then, these are really basically mainly just some cleanup bills and stuff. So, other than that, and of course, looking for bad bills. We're always vigilant on bills that try to micromanage Montana fish, wildlife, and parks. Those are the things that we think are best suited to the Fish and Wildlife
and that
Commission.
happens
Should not be
every
written in
single
state
session,
statute.
Nick.
So,
they are always trying to force the department to do something when the commission is the place where you get the public input and the discussion, all of that, rather than coming to the political craziness that is the legislature and trying to force that stuff and put it in statute. That just never works. It's so much better to have the commission do that work, because then a lot of times they're traveling to that local area and they spend time with the local people, listening and hearing what they have to say about their own area. And a lot of times that solves the problem, or they find that solution that works for that area. And the commission can do that in an area. The legislature is statewide. We are too statewide. And so you can't, it's not a good place to do things, because you got to give people their ability to do their solutions that work for them. And if we do it, then it applies to everybody, and then that doesn't work.
Yeah. I will say, I agree with you. The Fish and Wildlife Commission always allows people to make comments by going to all 7 of the regional headquarters. The area commissioners meet with their constituents, and I would be hard pressed to find another state agency that takes as much public input as Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And people might disagree with me. I could, you have that opportunity, and people are incredibly engaged. I will say that in the last few sessions, the sheer number of those bills has declined, and we're very thankful for that. And I think that's a great thing. So, so that's, we're cautious. We're optimistic that this won't be a session with quite the sheer number of bills on fish and wildlife. Let me turn it to Frank a little bit, and let's talk about the federal level. And of course, this is a little more Montana Wildlife Federation centric, but what we're looking at with federal legislation or efforts. Frank, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Sure, and thank you, Senator, for bringing your insight and energy to the conservation space in Montana. We look forward to collaborating with you once the session begins, actually in the run up to and during the session, and we'll certainly help you. I think you made a very strong point at the beginning about the need and the value in educating new legislators. There's just, this is Montana Wildlife Federation, our board, our policy committees, our affiliates across the state. We believe in sort of following the best available science, and I know you're there too. Yeah, but that takes some education. So that takes educating elected officials and so on and so forth. So it's wonderful to have partners like you. And I salute you for stepping forward and stepping into public service. Thank you for that. We think about Washington in 2021 and beyond. Frankly, we're really excited about the opportunities that could be present for conservation in Montana. We'll start with the challenges. I mentioned science before. There's sort of the big twin threats to wildlife and habitat in Montana, and that's biodiversity loss and the climate crisis. And so, we're going to continue to press our case for appointments to either the Trump or Biden administration early next year to have appointees who take science and lead with science and manage forests and wildlife and agriculture and fisheries and public health, candidly, using the best available science. Montana Wildlife Federation has fought with our fellow National Wildlife Federation affiliates and so many others against the former acting director of the Bureau of Land Management, someone who has advocated for selling off our public land to the highest bidder. And so we're going to continue to be vigilant against self-dealers like that in federal agencies. And we're going to continue our call to the Montana delegation to oppose folks like that who want to separate Montanans from their public land and other, wildlife and habitat resources. Some of the specific things, some of the specific pieces of legislation that we're really optimistic about. One is called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That would pump money into the state, actually, Senator, and it would be money targeted towards species that are on their way towards endangered species listing. So it would allow the state to partner with the federal government, private landowners, and others to put together cooperative initiatives like the sage grouse initiative to slow the drivers endangering threatened species. And so it would be a huge infusion of money into the state. It's one of the reasons we're so excited about Recovering America's Wildlife Act. I guess I should point out that we're celebrating the passage of another major infusion money into Montana, and that's full permanent authorization and full funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Again, the federal, state, local nexus just means so much to all Montanans. LWCF started under President Eisenhower and is like all real conservation victories have been bipartisan, which adds to their durability. But LWCF now, we look forward to working with you, Senator, and the next gubernatorial administration on identifying diverse projects. LWCF funding can go to city parks, in counties, in townships, just as easily as it can go to fund fish, wildlife, and parks projects, and expand access for hunters and anglers. Like I know Senator and Nick, you folks have seen the increasing pressure on Montana's habitat as a result of everyone wanting to do social distancing outdoors. The parks, the boat access, the boat ramps, they've really been put under quite a bit of stress. And we look forward to working with the next administration, both in Helena and in Washington, bringing some money here to help ease some of that infrastructure and put people to work and allow more people to enjoy the great outdoors here. So, Senator, I'm interested in your perspective on federal opportunities that could help inform our work.
Well, and I love the work that you guys do because it really is that coalition building. I mean, you're working with other groups to bring everybody to the table, whether that's the landowner groups, whether that's, other conservation groups, and the group effort that you guys generate on the projects that happen in Montana is tremendous. And so I respect and think you guys do a great job of really getting the folks to the table that need to be there to have those conversations. And then you're also then working with our congressional delegation to do what's right for Montana. And that's the biggest thing that we can do, is to get out on the ground and listen to the folks in every one of those areas about what do they need, and then meet those needs. Because, we can say all we want to about wildlife and protecting that and all of that, but when you partner with people on the ground, that creates that lasting effort that goes on forever. And it's a heritage building kind of a thing for all of us here in Montana. So I appreciate what you guys do out on the ground and keeping everybody together working towards a great end.
Thank you. Some of the other collaborative conservation projects that we're going to be working on at the state and federal level include some work on migratory corridors, particularly for pronghorn. We're engaged right now at the state and federal level. Going to need continue to look to Helena to increase pressure, frankly, on Washington on a particular issue that threatens the water in fish up where you're at right now, Nick, in Kalispell. British Columbia mines are ramping up and emitting a highly toxic chemical called selenium that increases fish mortality and is being picked up at greater frequencies in northwest Montana. And so the allowable amount of selenium can't be increased. And so we're going to be looking to, like I said, either the next administration, whether that's Trump or Biden, to increase pressure on the Canadian government and the province of British Columbia to stop selenium from jeopardizing Montana's fish and wildlife and public health up in northwest Montana.
If you would mind me talking about that one, Frank, just a little bit. I'm
Is
on
it?
the Water Policy Interim Committee.
Okay.
And so we had a big discussion about the selenium issue up there because the Department of Environmental Quality is doing their rulemaking on changing the allowable amount of selenium in the water from 1.5 down to 0.8, so that we can put pressure not only on the Canadian government, but also cover our butts. Because when that water comes down from Lake Koocanusa and the Kootenai River and goes into Idaho, Idaho has already said that they could hold us, and we already know that, they could hold us accountable for the selenium that we allow through because of the Libby Dam. So if we don't do this and lower that amount so that then we can put pressure back on British Columbia and the Canadian government to reduce those levels that are actually coming in, the state of Montana could be liable for something that we don't do if we don't get a handle on it. So it's necessary for us to lower it so we can put the pressure on BC to do what they need to do, because they have 4 additional mines that are going in up there that could actually have the same problem and would continue to bleed into Montana. We cannot have that. We've got to address it as soon as possible on behalf of Montanans, or we're going to have the same kind of thing that we've had with Zortman Landusky, where we had to put $20 million aside for perpetual water treatment. And why should we have to do that when that industry needs to be held accountable to what they're doing? So we were able to stop. There was a effort by some legislators from up in that area to not to hold up this rulemaking, and we were able to stop them from doing it. But I'm sure we're going to hear about it in the next session. So I hope people really pay attention to that and why it's so necessary for Montana to step up and do this right now. It is imperative that we do it right now.
Well, thank you, Senator, for your leadership. Our affiliate up there, Flathead Wildlife Inc., and our federal policy lead, Alec Underwood, have been engaged with that process. Perhaps you've seen them on that Zoom.
With public comment, I mean, we were on 3 hours. It was awesome. They had some people at the table. It was fantastic.
Well, continue to let us know what we can do to support your leadership on that, and we're going to put pressure on the federal administration and our federal delegation on that, because there's just there's no upside. There's only downside. There's some other pieces of federal legislation that we're going to continue to champion, and that is the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act. In Helena, Senator, you might have seen the recent article on the Lincoln Prosperity Project. We have a staff member, a couple of staff members who've been involved in working with Montana Outdoors Business Council and the Wilderness Association and a couple of other partners with local businesses, seeking to put together some federal designations there at the southern end of the Bob Marshall that would translate into sustainable economic development and sustainable recreation, and improve the lives of local folks up there in northern Lewis and Clark County. Nick, Senator, I don't know if either you want to further discuss that or not, but we're really proud of that.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus has really taken the lead on that, but that was just really rolled out just a week ago, right, Frank? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, but that's there's some federal pieces to that in order for all the pieces to come together, and so we're excited about that. A couple of nights ago, we had a panel that featured the Custer Gallatin Forest Supervisor on expanding access. Well, Nick, you were on. You led the call, expanding access in the Crazy Mountains, and we're going to continue to look to work, and bring people together in a collaborative way. Landowners, hunters and anglers, people who like to hike, with other interested parties, local businesses. We have a board member in Livingston, John Salazar, who's part of the local initiative. And it's important for local leaders, for us to work with local leaders as we engage our federal delegation and federal federal policymakers on the administration side. So we're going to continue to try to pull people together and work the different levers that protect and enhance wildlife habitat and access in Montana. And I'll just end, Nick, with one of our clear priorities, as it has been and as it will continue to be, it will be to protect Montanans and Americans, candidly, from sort of getting ripped off from undervalued oil and gas development leases on public lands. The Department of Interior has sought to expand under market valued leases on our public lands here in Montana as a giveaway or a sop to oil and gas corporations. That type of ripoff and degradation is not something that we're going to support, and we're going to work to fight. And so get an idea of some of the some of the contours and some of the challenges that we have been engaged in. But I will say, I'll close with how I started. I'm just very optimistic about 2021 and the opportunity to work in a bipartisan way, in a collaborative way on conservation at the federal level, regardless of the election outcome. So,
good.
That's
Yeah.
the way it has to be, because you're going to have to work with whoever it is in order to do the work that you're doing. So we're going to all have to work together no matter what happens.
So I will say that on the issue of oil and gas, we just had a major victory Friday, 2 days ago, in federal court, where a federal judge threw out these resource management plans that cover more than 700,000 acres of Montana, that opened up 95% of those lands to oil and gas. Now, look, we understand that our public lands will be part of supplying our nation's energy needs, but to just blanket throw it out there in this energy dominance agenda is just wrong, with no consideration for fish and wildlife habitat and the enjoyment of those lands by all kinds of Americans. So that was a huge win, I will say. But I want to throw out a couple more things. I mean, we're talking, I can't, being up here in Kalispell, stress to everyone how much attention is on the former Weyerhaeuser lands that were sold to Southern Pines plantations. And there are a lot of people working feverishly to try to get a decent conservation outcome out of this and put easements on a lot of those lands. We have more than 20,000 acres of easements coming up in the Libby country. We have a 130,000 acre proposal that's in its infancy. We have a Fish, Wildlife, and Parks proposal near Dredger Ridge, which has the largest concentration of elk in Region 1 of FWP. And I mean, if you talk to Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks staff up here, they're hearing about this every day from people, because we're talking about more than 600,000 acres of land that Weyerhaeuser sold to Southern Pine plantations. And again, when you look at the in holding checkerboarded lands as well as adjoining public lands. The footprint is well over 1 million acres of what could be impacted by that. So we're fortunate that we have tools like the Land and Water Conservation Fund and Habitat Montana to work on these easements. We need to be going on that quickly. I don't know whether that will come forward in any legislative proposals this session, but it's a very important conservation issue. Just a couple other things, they're not all the things we deal with come in the Fish and Game and FWP committees in the House and Senate. I had the pleasure of serving on Governor Bullock's Grizzly Bear Advisory Council, and it was really a tremendous 10 months of work on that report, and I'm really proud of how that report turned out. I have said from the get-go that I do not want this to be a report that sits on a shelf and gathers dust. I want tangible things to come out of this. And we have been very active at MWF in supporting the livestock loss program for the dollars that go toward prevention work to prevent conflicts with grizzly bears before they happen. I think we'll be seeing a bill on that to increase funding, and it's going to be a tough session budget-wise, Senator, you know that, but it is worth doing preventive work up front. And frankly, I think it strengthens Montana's case in court as we move toward delisting and state management of grizzly bears, which I have strong faith in Montana FWP to do. We will continue to see aquatic invasive species. The program is up and running. I think they caught 34 boats this year that had them. I know Senator Cuff up here in Northwest Montana is very engaged in that issue. We are the last barrier to keep those invasive mussels out of the Columbia River system. And frankly, I think there should be some federal resources and dollars toward that because it's so important. Sage grouse conservation has been a big success. This is another area where MWF's strongly butted heads with the Trump administration over plans to undo those. The whole goal was to keep these species off the endangered species. Well, the goal was to conserve the species, but keep them off the list while allowing business to continue in eastern Montana. And it took a lot of, again, tremendously diverse interests at the table on that. And, ranchers and the oil and gas industry and local governments and conservation interests and hunting and angling organizations. And frankly, it was all thrown out by the Trump administration. And we think those plans are important to conserve the species. And then, of course, our whole suite of access programs, whether it's the Unlocking State Lands Program, the brand new PAL Act, the Public Access to Lands Act, which we're just now, Senator, getting some agreements coming forward. And like any new, fresh government program, it's going to take some time, but we should have some of those in place. Continue looking at migratory corridors for big game and wildlife. And that's what I have. So I don't know if you wanted to, Senator, any sort of final thoughts about the session? Are you optimistic we're going to have a functional sportsman's caucus, sportsmen and sportswomen's caucus?
Well, I think that it's building on itself. I think we had some real victories this last session in bringing, the diverse groups together to have this discussion. I mean, having the caucus itself with the legislative members, and then having this was the first session with our advisory council with all of the different groups being represented, I think was super helpful to having the discussion and then having recommendations come to the legislators. Because a lot of the things that I think could have really blown the session up did not this last session. And I think that's part of the education process also, is you have folks on there with the advisory council with all the different groups, whether that's landowners or, conservation or gun people or whatever, having them sit at the table together helped us, I think, sit better together at the table. And I think through that, we were able to have those really necessary discussions, before stuff hit the fan and before we had to really deal with it. We had a couple of things that made it through the process and had to be vetoed, but for the most part, I think we did a good job on wildlife issues in the last session. And I just see us building on that. if we continue to support the Sportsman's Caucus and continue to be able to give that venue for conversation about how this stuff affects different areas of Montana, I think if we all educate ourselves, we hopefully won't, go down the road that has been suggested by some of handing over, the federal lands to the state, or, things that we know are going to end up basically killing our Montana wildlife heritage. So
Right.
we have great venues to have conversations, and just supporting those and continuing to give voice to folks is what will be keeping a top priority.
Yeah. I keep coming up with these random thoughts. It just speaks to the breadth of wildlife resources we have in this state, fish and wildlife resources, and the habitat to support them. I was really thankful this interim that the Environmental Quality Council put a tremendous amount of attention on chronic wasting disease. Representative Keene was really, who chaired that, was really engaged in that, as was the whole council. I mean, Ken McDonald who runs the wildlife division of FWP, said their estimate was that our prevalence was at about 2%. And based on a sample size of 7,000 animals, they nailed it. And we can live with chronic wasting disease at 2%. What we don't want to see is certain herds in Wyoming that are up to 48%, and you will start to see reductions in big game herds. So legislatively, that's one of those things. I don't think we'll see any legislation, but the agency does need the financial resources to continue to manage that. And then lastly, we started off talking about the importance of our habitat programs. I could not go without mentioning a really legacy project on the horizon, and that is the Big Snowy Mountains Wildlife Management Area on the south end of the Big Snowies, roughly 30 miles east of Judith Gap. This is an area of the state where we don't have any wildlife management areas. It sits in the middle of one of the largest elk herds in Montana, and it adjoins more than 100,000 acres of federal public lands that are really hard to get to. So this was a ranch that was bequeathed to Chaudhare Children's Hospital in Helena. And Chaudhare said, we want this to become public land. And I think that, first off, that tremendously valuable organization deserves credit for that. We can't stress enough that this is still private land right now. And I've been hearing that Chaudhare's phone's been ringing off the hook with people wanting access there. But you have to respect their private property rights for the year. These are big, complicated land deals that take a long time to put together. We have a wonderful partner in the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and we're working on that. But we're hoping to see the Sporting Caucus come in and support that project, which is going to take a couple of years to put together. So that we're lucky to have Habitat Montana as a tool there. So, all right,
Nick,
I keep thinking of things. Let's try to close out here. We're running out of time. Frank, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if Habitat Montana finds itself in a position of new money and new revenue and new resources as a result of some of the ballot measures on the ballot here, we're going to fight tooth and nail to protect those allocations.
Yeah.
And to protect and to keep Habitat Montana whole, whether it's the non-game species or the accounts of particular concern to hunters and anglers. Senator Montana Wildlife Federation took the extraordinary step of endorsing the two legalization and conservation funding ballot measures because of the historic nature of what that new revenue into conservation in Montana could mean. So we're going to be, should that revenue should that revenue be authorized by the voters of Montana, part of our efforts at education will be defending those allocations.
But I will stress, that will not affect the biennial budget for 2022 and 2023. Yes, but I agree with you.
We're not going to let it. We're not
In
gonna
other
let
words,
it-
the money wouldn't come in for the budget that we'll be writing here in a few months. So-
Understood.
But you're right. We will vigorously defend the will of the Montana voter. So,
Right. And then the second thing, and we're going to have a panel on this here in about an hour.
No.
Speaking of collaborative approaches, we're supporters of a Charlie M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge in central Montana, north of the river, UL Bend, that hosts a herd of wild buffalo. We're interested in seeing wild herd come back for the opportunities for hunting, for the cultural significance it has for First Peoples in Montana, and it's it could be an economic development driver for central Montana as well, and so we're going to be working with you, Senator, and your colleagues on trying to find state match money for the Department of Interior's plan for a reintroduction in the Charlie M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. And so it is an iconic species, and it's going to certainly require all of our skills as collaborators to find a way forward on that one.
Very interesting.
there's a lot of hard conversations that need to be had about that. So, well, we're about out of time here. I think we should wrap this up. As you know, as the senator knows, as we know at MWF, that, boy, there's two things that get a lot of attention at the legislature. What is the other one? Well, I don't know. I remember one of my journalism professors said that, but one of them are fish and wildlife bills. So we'll be there, and we encourage people to certainly sign up for our legislative action team at the MWF, and you'll get regular updates, weekly sort of synopses of how the week went at the legislature on fish and wildlife and habitat and access issues, as well as action alerts when we really need people to take action. So with that,
please participate in the legislative session. We need folks to put pressure from their local areas on their local legislators.
Yep.
In order to get this stuff done. We cannot do it with just these guys, these two guys that are on here standing in front of a microphone. It is the action of people out on the ground that gets this stuff done.
absolutely. All right. Well, everyone stay warm. Thank you. And we will, hopefully it's happy hunting and then for the next few weeks, and then we get down to business after the election. So
Sounds
thanks,
good.
everyone. Thanks for
Senator
joining
Nick,
us.
thank you.
Take care. Bye.